Welcome back to another Education is Possible, a podcast exploring educational, radical potential and transformative work of scholars and teachers across the world.
We're your hosts, Jordan and Y. So we've talked a lot on this podcast about education as a form of solidarity, and that's something that we'd love to explore more specifically. So, Y, could you tell us a little bit about today's episode?
So today we're honored to have the incredible educators and researchers, Dr. Shatara and Dr. Saleh. In this episode, we dive deeper into their powerful paper, Solidarities with for Palestine and Palestinians, a call to action for educators. Their work invites teachers, scholars, and communities to imagine what solidarity looks like inside classrooms and beyond, grounded in justice, empathy, and collective responsibility. Together, we'll talk about what it means to teach for liberation, to resist erasure, and to nurture spaces of care and connection in the face of ongoing colonial violence. So stay tuned. This conversation will challenge, move, and inspire you to rethink what solidarity in education truly means.
Dr. Shatara, Dr. Saleh, welcome to another Education is Possible. How are you both doing?
We're good as can, or at least I'm good as can be.
Yeah, that's actually been the way that I've framed every time I've asked somebody is how I hope you're doing as well as possible for the last several years. Yeah. And I am doing as well as I can be as well.
Well, it is wonderful to have you here. And yes, I hope we are all getting by in the hellscape and continuing to fight. So let's jump in. We're going to talk tonight about educational solidarity with and for Palestine and Palestinians. And that's really a term that is used so frequently. It sometimes feels like it's used in these empty and performative ways. So what does it actually look like when people take up solidarity with and for Palestine and Palestinians, particularly within the context of education?
I can start and then hand it over to Dr. Saleh. But I think thinking about solidarity with and for Palestine and Palestinians, we came to this piece together, particularly in 2021, when there was another Israeli siege on Gaza. This is not the first one, and it obviously wasn't the last one. And so we were noticing that there were some people who were speaking out for Palestine and for Palestinians, but there were a lot of folks in education who weren't saying anything. And so a lot of times when education folks are saying like they're very justice oriented, they're thinking about anti-racism, culture sustaining pedagogy, all of these ways of being that are critical and decolonizing and anti-colonial, Palestine ends up getting left out. And so there obviously in our piece, we talk about many different ways that we can be in solidarity with and for Palestine and the many different ways it looks like. But a lot of it is really just like naming Palestine, naming Palestinians as a part of your justice work. And understanding that when you are saying that you're going against the empire, you're going against Israel, you're going against the so-called United States or so-called Canada, the Western powers. And so even just naming it, but naming it as part of your justice work is really important because you can do all this justice work or progressive work. And then if you leave out Palestine, you're leaving out people, you're leaving out people's voices, you're leaving out also the implications of Israel being a settler colonial state on land that Palestinians are indigenous to. So kind of understanding that naming that it's not the only way, but it's one way to be in solidarity with and for Palestinians.
I think you encapsulated how we came to this work at the same time as we were feeling heartbroken and infuriated. Of course, in witnessing the destruction for the 11-day siege and bombing and bombardment, which is recurring, but also because we are part of communities. And I'm putting that in air quotes, because we're really talking about anti-racism, abolitionist praxis, decolonial, anti-colonial. They're using the words but I didn't feel that it was with everybody, every oppressed group, every social justice issue. It didn't feel like it was very comprehensive in truth. Quite often it seemed to be ego driven, if I'm going to be real. And if I'm not anything, but I'm real, I'm going to say it, because it just seemed to me that very surface level, really shallow. Not for everybody and not at all times. Just the vibe, the overall sense I was getting is that as long as it doesn't get me in too much trouble, as long as I don't get on any of these lists that might make it harder for me to get a job, as long as I don't, there was always a qualifier, which I actually understand. People need to live. They need to get jobs, but at the same point, then be honest about it. Don't just pretend it's not there. And that's where I felt like it was just silence. It wasn't somebody saying, listen, I really loved your piece, or I love what you're saying here, but I can't really amplify it the way I wish I could, because just be honest, be real about it. But there wasn't the courage to even have the conversation. And so I felt really disillusioned, I think would be the word that I would use, with some of the spaces and so-called communities. I was, like, where we're begging. It's not even so much that we just felt like you should be in solidarity. People are literally being murdered at this moment in time. We need all the voices to say, stop with this, like death making, the constant death making. And there wasn't many to actually use their voice and say that, and to have that very basic level of solidarity with people who are being oppressed. And in the moment that when it's needed the most. And that was in 2021. I think for me, solidarity with and for, we were really wanting to get that paper out around 2021, 2022. And that's its own conversation about the multiple. We actually got an award for it, and then we couldn't get it published, which it's its own journey to kind of finally, by the time that it got published, it was not what we would have written in the moment by the time it was published, because that was 4 years ago, almost like 3 years ago.
Dr. Shatara, you write about being in solidarity with Palestinians and for Palestine. Could you explain that distinction and why both are needed in education?
Yes. So when we were writing this, we were writing, we were using the words with and for, like in different places. And then we decided to say, no, it's with and for, like it's together. Like we're in solidarity with Palestinians, working alongside with them, understanding their perspectives, and also understanding that the perspectives that they're giving are the most valid ones, the ones that if Palestinians are talking about their lived experiences and they're talking about what is happening to them and the oppression and the genocide, if they're saying it's a genocide, it's a genocide. And so understanding that when solidarity is with Palestinians, like how are you listening to their voices and uplifting their voices and valid, like they're the voices. You're not going to talk to somebody else who's not Palestinian, who's not like understanding the circumstances that are there. And so that solidarity with Palestinians is really important. And then we also talked about solidarity for Palestine. So the for is really thinking, because we didn't just want to write about Palestinians, we also wanted to talk about Palestine as this place, as a state, as a nation, as who we are as people, that this is the land that we're on, this is our land. And if we take away Palestine, and we have Palestinians, that means that we're not as connected to the land. And so it's solidarity with Palestinians and for Palestine, that there is this liberation for the nation of Palestine, for us, for the land that we're in, because Israel is a settler colonial state. And so understanding that it's not just the solidarity with the people, but it's also with the land, for the land, that you're working for liberation for the land, for Palestinians.
In this moment, of course, we continue to live in a world that functions on anti-Palestinian racism. But there's also this clamoring from educators in particular to make education a force for solidarity. So for folks who are looking to take up this work, who are either teachers or engage in education work in other spaces, how might they engage in the work of education and solidarity with and for Palestine and Palestinians?
This is something that I'm actually currently writing about, because so often we approach things from a checklist as educators. This is because everything, you have a list, you have a to-do list, and there's so much to get done as a teacher and as an educator generally, that quite often you have a to-do list and you check them off. That's how we approach any kind of program quite often, including DEI or whatever, something that somebody's suggesting. Okay, have I done this? And it almost is approached as a checklist. And so one of the things that I'm a teacher educator for social studies educators, and what I constantly remind students of is, where's your spirit at? You have to reevaluate, and this is an Islamic concept, to be honest. You have to reevaluate your intentions. Like, what's your intentions as you do this work? What are you hoping? But always remembering that intention does not trump impact. Even if your intention is to do this, if somebody from within this group that you're hoping to be in solidarity with is telling you this is problematic, then you listen to the group in the community that you're supposedly in solidarity with. So quite often solidarity is approached from that checklist, surface level. Oh, and you announce your solidarity. And yes, of course, sometimes you do have to say, I'm in solidarity with this group, just to affirm, but solidarity requires more than a pronouncement. Much more. It requires you to learn. It requires you quite often to unlearn. It requires you to be humble, to not be at the center, to take a step back. Let you be led by the people that you're supposedly in solidarity with, to take that time to really consider, why do I feel so strongly about this? How can I, what do I have? What gifts, what talents do I have that will lend themselves well to this cause, this movement? How do I organize alongside others? Because it's not individual. It's always going to be collective work. But also, how do I make connections across different organizations and movements as much as possible, so that everybody is working all together for everything that is needed to make this world I talked about death making, to make it more life-giving and life-sustaining.
I think it's, what are, your gifts, your motivation, your aspects, but also what are your privileges? What are your privileges in the ways that you can be in solidarity, and understanding that that privilege gives you more access than maybe some other people. So kind of understanding that, like, sometimes the privileges that you have, you might not get the same consequences if a Palestinian American or a Muslim American or anything that speaks out. And then also in terms of what educators, like how they can take it up, I think that we can be very, and I'm saying we as also, I'm also a social studies teacher educator, but how can we use the tools that we have to be able to talk and teach about Palestine? It's interesting. Dr. Saleh and we're like very aligned, but I think Dr. Saleh is really good at this, like the theory stuff. And I'm like, okay, what does it look like? I think that's when we were like writing it. It was just very much like, I'm like, okay, let me tell you what it's going to look like in the classroom. And doesn't have to be just in the classroom. It can be in other spaces as well too. But like, how are you bringing this up? So for example, if you're going to talk about media, how is it the language that's being used to talk about Palestine and Palestinians? Is it even in there? What words are being used? Is it dehumanizing? Is it passive? Is it active voice? Really being critical of that, especially as educators are worried about, like, how can I talk about this in schools without getting in trouble? Well, why don't you just talk about current events and just look at the headlines? And thinking about, well, like, we're doing media literacy right now. It connects with the standards. It works in all these many different ways. I've done some professional developments with teachers to really let's look at these different headlines and the ways that they've dehumanized Palestine and Palestinians in the media. And typically when teachers go and like, oh, I need to be informed about something that's happening in current events, they'll like grab a New York Times newspaper or something like that and not even realize that the ways that it's being written are against Palestinians, and they're erasing Palestine as well too. But even that doesn't have to be just in the classroom. How are you working with your community members, your friends, your family? Thinking about how are you also being like, hey, did you notice that the words that are being used there are in passive voice instead of active voice? I mean, it might be a while since people took an English class, but even just a tweet from October 7th in 2023 said that Israelis were killed while Palestinians died. And now who gets to be killed and who gets to die? And why is it distinct in that way? What is it trying to promote? What is it trying to prove? And that's something I'm also working on, hoping to get something like this published with another colleague of mine, but to really thinking about what are the words that are being used and how it's intentional, and how that the media is a part of the empire, how the media is working against marginalized groups, against Palestinians, against people of color, communities of color, Black and Indigenous communities, and really thinking about how they are these mouthpieces of the empires and they work to keep the empire going. And the empire meaning Israel and the West.
I was just going to add that for Americans, it would be New York Times. For Canadians, there's multiple, but like the Globe and Mail, the National Post. One of the things that I also encourage educators to do is to look. So you have these newspapers, but we don't really know who owns them and what their histories are. And so to look at connections. So who profits from this as well? Because we know that racial capitalism undergirds almost everything, almost all of our experiences, and imperialism. And so making those connections to the larger systems, because yes, Palestine, of course, I'm Palestinian, you know, of course, it's so important to everything I am, all I do. But there's also the fact that there's when we see what's happening in Congo and in Sudan and in Haiti, and to indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and in Australia, you know, you start to those connections between racial capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, all of the isms, the global isms, they're brought into full relief the more connections that you can make to show, hey, yes, it's happening, of course, in Palestine, and it's right now because the genocide, we need to be speaking out most as loud but there's also, of course, what you're seeing happening in Sudan, what you're seeing happening in Congo, what you're seeing this is all connected. And I don't know that I know that I need to do a better job at making those connections more explicit, more consistently. I can say that for myself for sure too.
And I think also with the recent genocide, just to add on, is that I think that it brought these other genocides that are happening throughout the world into more light, as well as also thinking about the history of genocides that have happened in places that maybe don't get talked about that much, whether it's in classrooms or in the mainstream. And so I think that Palestine has become this like way for people to really understand the world around them and to understand those connections, like thinking about Congo and Sudan and Haiti and again, and all of these and all of the people there are speaking about it. And I think that's really important to also amplify those voices as educators too, that we're thinking about them. And while we have the New York Times in the United States, as well as other media groups, it's also like the Guardian and the BBC in the UK. And so kind of, again, understanding like how much the West is controlling the ways that people are going to think and perceive, and not really being critical thinkers, not asking those questions. And that's, I think, in a sense, what educators might do to take up this work on solidarity is like, how do we question, how do we think, how do we make connections?
What the two of you are showing too is that this is something that is deeply educative. We are taught something when the New York Times uses prisoners for some people and hostages for other people. We are taught a lesson when, to use your example, Dr. Shatara of England, Palestine action is criminalized to the point where you literally cannot say those words together or wear a t-shirt that shows those words. We're supposed to learn to be silent. And I think that brings up a question about something that's really powerful in your work is that the two of you talk about the need to contextualize and not just universalize. But I do want, so of course, this is going to be a contextualized question for everybody, depending on their experience, their position, where they exist in power structures. But how might educators in various contexts approach this question, knowing the fierce repression that they will face for engaging in acts of solidarity? And how can they work towards still education as a form of solidarity?
I think that for me, that's a really, really, really good question, because my last presentation, actually, it was a few weeks ago. I'm really starting to think of something called a curriculum of Makluba. And if Palestinians and most Arabs know that Makluba, or I say Matluba because that's just the way that we say it, like really quick and colloquially.
And I say it Matlube.
Yeah.
So it's a little
And
different.
how do you say it? I just want to kind of get a sense.
Same here, مقلوبة.
Oh,
Okay. Okay, so because what happens is there's variations, of course, but it literally translates to upside down. And if anybody's seen those videos of like, you know, the big pot of the rice and, you know, like the different kind of the chicken or whatever meat is put in and, you know, the fried vegetables, and then you flip it, right? And then it's like this tower of amazing food. So what matluba for me, because it literally translates as upside down. And I'm really thinking with a scholar here, his name is Joshua Seeley Harrington. He talks about racist anti-racism. So not only are people, and this has been documented for decades now, not only are people censored, silenced, not only do Palestinians sometimes self-censor and or allies or supporters because they know they can be attacked. They know they will be accused of being anti-Semitic and or racist themselves. This has been decades, but right now, DEI and or anti-racist, I guess, frameworks and policies are actually being weaponized as well. So that's what racist anti-racism means. So not only are you not benefiting as a person of color, as a member of a systemically oppressed group, from these DEI/anti-racism/ whatever they're calling them, policies, they're actually harming you for saying this genocide needs to stop. Zionist settler colonization has, for the last almost 8 decades now, wreaked havoc on, and that's what Nakba is, it's catastrophe. It's wreaked havoc on Palestine, Palestinians, and Palestinian communities. So if you say that, you will be targeted as being a racist, to say what your actual lived experience is and has been and continues to be for so many Palestinians. My family, for example, Siti, Allah yarhamha, one of my grandmas, she was shot in her back and she lived with that bullet in her back because we lived in Ghar al-Khat. It was a small village in Safad. And then they were forced out of their village, both sides of my family, into Lebanon as refugees. My parents were born and raised as refugees in Lebanon. And then they were able to come to Canada. But intergenerationally, most of my family members still live as refugees in Lebanon. And so for me to say, hey, they deserve self-determination, they deserve their return, we all deserve to go back, to be able to go back home. I'm racist, so that will be weaponized as me denying whatever, or especially through the IHRA definition that's being there's such a push for now almost a decade for it to be entrenched in different systems. The Canadian government actually legislated its use. It's actually formally adopted by the Canadian government. I live in Alberta. It's been adopted by the Alberta government. Different institutions have adopted. So basically, where they have the actual definition is not problematic. It's the illustrative examples. 7 of 11 of those examples specifically talk about Zionism and or Israel. So you can't critique Zionism, which is a foundational, as Mohammed Ayyash talks about, it's a foundational Palestinian critique, to critique Zionism itself. Because without Zionism, there would not be the settler colonial conquest of Palestine. And so I'm going to stop there, but this racist anti-racism has really continues to censor, silence, and oppress as well.
I think the question is like, what advice would you give for educators kind of navigating through all of this tension and stuff like that? And I always think this is something that I talk to my teacher candidates about when they're thinking about teaching anti-racism or thinking about Black histories, Indigenous histories, things that are quote unquote and not really controversial. And so I always say, start by know your people. the people that are going to that are aligned with what you believe in and aligned with humanity, because it's not just like a belief, like that is with humanity. But know those people and kind of understand the ways that they also navigate too, because a lot of the times it's you can learn a lot and you can be resistant even through observation and kind of paying attention to like what people are saying and what people are doing. Who do I trust? Who do I not trust? Especially if you're in a new like school or institution, and that's what I've been doing. I've been at my institution. I'm going into I'm in my third year at the moment, and I had to figure out, okay, who am I going to trust and who am I not going to trust? And so kind of understanding that. But even so, it's one of those things where I always still say like I'm Palestinian. Like when I introduce myself, like I don't just say that I'm Arab. I say that I'm Palestinian. And so like people are going to get uncomfortable, and there's a little part of me as well too that I can tell educators is like, well, just get over the uncomfortability. Like when you're uncomfortable, it leads you to growth. And so like if you're making people feel uncomfortable, whatever, they're growing, they're learning. And so I'm always like thinking, okay, let's do that. And so it's about like knowing your people, knowing like how that like what you say might cause people to be uncomfortable, but what is it that you said that's going to cause people to be uncomfortable, and kind of understanding that. And I understand those fears of being called anti-Semitic, and that definition of anti-Semitism is there, and how it's starting to be embedded within state standards in the United States, in schools. In California, AB 715 was passed, and it's essentially establishing a Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education with a anti-Semitism like coordinator or prevention coordinator in the role. And they're going to be monitoring how schools are dealing with anti-Semitism, and they're using the IHRA anti-Semitism definition as a way to determine whether or not people or curriculum or students or faculty or anybody is anti-Semitic. And so then that ends up fueling to the censorship, the fear, the ways that Palestinians can't be themselves, or can't learn about that because of these ways that Zionists are coming in and infiltrating these systems, and they're using the system of whiteness to be able to infiltrate all these different areas. And it's not just in education. We know it because our field is in education, but it's in the medical field, it's in infrastructure, it's in everywhere. And so kind of understanding also like ways for us to navigate is to kind of do that research, and kind of like what Dr. Saleh was saying, understand where is all this coming from, scale it back, and like, why is this happening? And then critique it in that way as a way to be like, here's an example with this, and here's an example with that. The other thing too is like, as educators are trying to navigate these tensions, it's also thinking about reading up on the work of Palestinians and really understanding that context. Dr. Corson is saying, like, when we wrote in our article about it's important to contextualize, it's really important to contextualize and really understand Palestinian history, and kind of understanding that like it didn't just happen in 2023. It didn't happen in 2021. All of Israel began 70 plus years ago, but then it was also the British and the ways that they also created this colonial state after World War I. And so understanding that, like reading and being able to understand from Palestinians this context, so that if someone does say something to you or accuses you of anti-Semitism or accuses you of being racist, that you know your stuff, and your stuff from Palestinians. We've been saying this stuff for many, many, many years. It's just been a lot more amplified in the past 2 years because of the genocide in Gaza, but it's also, we're also like the West Bank as well too, thinking about the illegal settlements that are in there, and understanding that like all of that contextualization is helpful, because then you'll realize, oh, what Israel's doing is illegal under international law, and they're continuing to do that and getting away with it because they're part of the empire, because the West is supporting them and allies with them and gives them all of this money, billions of dollars that can be used to look at the problems in our country. And so really kind of understanding that context is really important. I always tell folks to read The 100 Years' War by Rashid Khalidi, and also Justice for Some by Noura Arakat, and she takes on a more international law perspective because her field is in law. There's many, many other folks. Those are just
Mhm.
two out of the like hundreds that are out there, but really thinking about how are you going to be intentional and educating yourself so that you're able to then talk about, well, I'm referencing this or I'm referencing that.
And I think for those, because sometimes, and I'm just going to explicitly say this, I teach against racism immediately. So basically, especially as a Muslim woman in hijab, Palestinian, I know when I go into a space for people who don't really know me, don't know what I'm about, I'm going to be needing to spend a little bit of time to build a little bit of familiarity, recognition, trust. Unfortunately, even for people that say that they're anti-racist, because it's been so hardwired into so many of us, generally, this mistrust of Muslims, mistrust of Arabs, mistrust of Palestinians in specific as well. I immediately teach against that. So I actually tell them, I'm actually going to use sources that aren't Muslim, that aren't Palestinian from the beginning, because I have to teach against your racism to begin with. I explicitly name it to start. And then I start there and then I build until I can say, okay, so what they're saying, here's what Palestinians have been saying. So I can flesh that out. But sometimes that's the approach I take, because I know that, again, because anti-Palestinian racism is so intertwined with Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, because they mobilize each other. And you'll see that, by the way, it's being mobilized currently much more. You'll see a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric right now online. That is actually by design, because a few months ago, now look this up, the Israeli government commissioned a report and a study about how to change the perception of Israel in the wake of so many people being anti-Israel because of the genocide that they're committing. And one of the main ways of doing that they learned was through mobilizing Islamophobia. This is literally by design at this point, because since I read that a few months ago, I'm seeing this happening more and more often, this deliberate conflation with all Muslims, quote unquote jihadis, quote unquote, because before we were trying to separate, to say, hey, you can't just say this is Islamophobia, you have to name Palestinians, because you're erasing Palestinians when you're naming anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia. More and more, it's hard to separate, because they're mobilizing both together. But basically, one of the things when I talk about the curriculum of Ma'luba or Ma'lubi is to say, as much as, we're encountering these inversions, this upside down reality and history and world, Palestinians have always taught their children in ways that has kept our memories, our histories, our love for each other and for Palestine alive. And so, as much as, there's all of this, and it's been there for decades, we know who we are. And so that is our own curriculum. Quite often we are learning about real history, real systems of oppression at home. I learned to distrust the media at home when I'm seeing a picture of a father trying to shield his son and him being shot, but on Arabic television stations. I'm hearing radio coverage at home that I've never heard in English. We're learning these things just naturally by living as Palestinians in community. And so that's what I really wanted to bring to the fore through my work, is that not everybody has that opportunity, of course. So that's why when Dr. Shatara says, when you say that it's so important to follow Palestine, there's a reason, because we know this through our bones, through every part of how we live. But of course, to follow and actually amplify the voices of Palestinians living in Gaza, from Gaza, West Bank right now currently, and intergenerationally, to learn stories of history as well. Especially people like my grandma, who's not here anymore, who shared them, and we need to amplify those stories too.
Dr. Shatara, on a personal note, what gives you hope in the face of censorship and repression? What moments of solidarity have reminded you that education can still be an act of love, courage, and transformation?
Thank you for that question. I think, sometimes we're talking about all this, death and hate and oppression, but not really thinking about what's that hope, because a lot of times is the oppressors want to take away hope from us. And when they take away hope from us, then they know that they've won. And so I think for me, on a personal note, what I think gives me hope are the young people of the world today who are putting themselves out there, speaking up, really being on the streets, organizing and working across different racial groups, ethnicities, religions, ages as well too, like really being on the forefront, putting themselves out there. I went to a protest with my mom, and it was in San Francisco, and we went. And one thing that my mom said is that, wow, it's not just Arabs that are here. And seeing that that's the hope, is that young people are speaking out, and the oppressors are very much afraid of young people. They're afraid of what's happening. They're going in and censoring social media accounts that are being used to talk about Palestine. So that's a sense of hope for me, in the sense that like young people are, like even young people like yourselves who are really educating yourselves and thinking about what can I do, whether it's being an educator or educating in many, many different spaces. Dr. Saleh was talking about the ways that Palestinian families educate the next generation on, and thinking about how can people who are not Palestinian educate about Palestine. How can also, and not just about Palestine, but like all oppressed groups and marginalized groups, especially within racial capitalism and settler colonialism. And so understanding that, like, how can educate, I think also another piece of hope for me is how education is really this piece, not schools, but education as this moment of like transformation and liberation. And how even these acts of love, of working together, of being in community with one another, is a way that we can disrupt systems. Even the encampments in 2024, being in those spaces, my campus had one. Being in that space for the time that the encampment was there was such a liberating space. I was there with some faculty members who were in solidarity. It was led by a lot of student and youth activists, and just being in that space and seeing that space, being like, well, look what they are doing to make sure that Palestine is on the forefront, that people are not just ignoring it, but like as they walk by the encampment, which is in the middle of campus, that it's there. And that they're seeing it, and that it's not that it's visible. And so I think for me, that's just one piece. I'm sure I can talk about more pieces of hope, but for me, it's like just the young people who are really on the forefront and who are speaking out and being willing to put themselves out there and put themselves at risk, so that they know that like in the end, like they're doing this for Palestine, because Palestinians are going through so much more hardships than what having an encampment does and is.
I think there was something great that, I mean, you all shared so many great things, but I was thinking one thing that Dr. Salas shared that I think I have two examples, one that affirms it and one that offers the opposite, which I think is very useful. Last year, we did an event that was actually part of the first season of the podcast. Maura Finkelstein came and spoke about being fired. And then one of the lovely I don't want to say community members, but person who lived in the area said, "You have been shamed, you have been fired, you have been discredited." And instead of fighting back, Maura said, "That's fine. You're right. Who cares? Don't listen to me. I don't need any credibility." You know who has credibility? The Palestinians who are living this and are sharing their experiences every day. And I think that speaks exactly to what Dr. Saleh was sharing. On the other side of that, within Israel, they tell the truth and they just own it. They will share exactly what they are doing and be proud of it. And then to the international community, try to obfuscate what they're actually doing to spin the narrative as if this is self-defense and all of that. Palestinians are sharing their truth, and so too are folks in the Zionist entity, but obviously one is in a liberatory way and one is in a genocidal way.
They're not the Zionists and the Israelis are not hiding anything because of the ways that the empire, the media, all of that, the ways that we're just viewed as brown people in the world that are just not important. And so because of that, then they're able to be more open about that, because it's like, oh, I mean, just like how today the Republicans in the United States are very much open about their racism. And so kind of understanding that, that they can explicitly say that, like, oh, we're targeting Latin American communities in the United States with ICE, and that ICE is coming in and really infiltrating and invading our cities, and the ways that people are showing solidarity against ICE. So really like understanding that, like, they're using, and just like what Dr. Saleh said, I think that's the connection you're making, Dr. Corson, is that like these connections of like the ways that they're going to like mess with people's brains and to think of like, oh, that these people are less than, and that's essentially what it is. And also the ways that like it also erases people too, because Palestinians are very diverse in so many different ways. You just learned how we say matlube or maklube in different ways. There's that diversity too, the understanding that like we're just not monoliths, we're not like just all one and same people. So kind of understanding that like even with that there's still these like differences, and so that it continues to add this erasure as well too, as they're trying to like make us be seen and continue, because this is not like the first time, but to make us be seen as the other, as villains, as using these like very much anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab terms against us. And so I think that's like a way to kind of connect it in that way, to think about how like it's the same tactics being used, and it's white supremacy is being used over and over in so many different ways against different communities. And that's what it is. And that's how like Zionists and Israelis are using, and even, Zionists in the United States are using the institutions of white supremacy to be seen as like, oh, we are the ones that are important, versus like seeing like, okay, well, how you're literally supporting a genocidal state.
Dr. Saleh, on a personal note, what gives you hope in the face of censorship and repression? What moments of solidarity have reminded you that education can still be an act of love, courage, and transformation?
Actually, there's multiple sources of hope, because I guess because we know the long history, we know that, for example, I know my grandparents, Allah yarhamun, they not only faced horrific violence, colonial violence, but they survived it. And my parents grew up as refugees, and they were able to not only survive that, but thrive. And so many of my family members. So I know over the history of Palestinian struggle, I'm not trying to romanticize it, but I know that gives me hope, knowing that, alhamdulillah, we've been able to overcome over decades, and to continue, and to teach, and to love, and to, so that, of course, just knowing that history is a source of hope. My faith is a source of hope, because I don't know if I didn't, truthfully, if I didn't have that faith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there's a reason for everything, and Allah tests those that He loves. For many, that's their source of faith, and I know that that's not maybe, a leftist, or, whatever people want to call it, but that's for me, has always been a source of hope. But the number one for me has been people from Gaza specifically, and students. People from Gaza, again, not to romanticize, not to exceptionalize, but to just to see all of these teachers, and they teach in multiple ways, by cooking, by building, by digging through the rubble together as a community, like all of these different ways that Palestinians teach life, teach love, teach strength and faith. But then our students in different places in the world, but including here at, in Edmonton, for example, they faced horrific violence from state representatives and police, rhetorical violence, but also physical through the militaristic deployment of police services and services. But when they kept saying, people are literally being murdered right now, whatever violence I face. And I don't want to just put everything on our students' shoulders. We need, like, know that, and I said that to them. We adults The people, they are adults, but I'm saying the older adults need to step up. The educators, the people across society, they were doing things fearlessly, and we needed to do the same, in truth.
It's just like this work really resonated with me. Like I live in a very like conservative part of Michigan, and I'm a substitute, so there's not like a ton that I can do within like the academic sphere itself, but I have had, like, because I'm a Holocaust and genocide scholar, some like English teachers reach out to me and like ask about like the Holocaust and Israel and whatnot. And it's been a little bit of a battle to get some of them to see that like the Nakba and Palestine are equally important in that conversation as well. And like I think find like the emphases that you have on having like solidarity with and for like Palestine and Palestinians, and the many ways that you've gone have spoken to us and provided examples of what that can look like has given me hope that like there are other avenues I can pursue when I've kind of been hitting a lot of dead ends.
Thank you for sharing. Being a substitute teacher is a whole, it's a whole lot. And, thinking about going into classrooms that are maybe not necessarily like, with your curriculum or stuff like that. But I think that there are so many different ways to approach Palestine in all the different fields. Like I said, like, even though it's just an education, but you could even think about not just in history classes, or we have ethnic studies classes here in California, but really thinking about like, how is this in science? And I've done professional developments where we're like, well, let's look at water. Let's look at water scarcity. Let's look at it here. Let's look at it in Flint. Let's look at it in South Africa. Well, let's look at it in Palestine. Let's look at it in terms of the water emergency and the ways that water is rationed out in Palestine by Israel. And so kind of understanding that like there are many different avenues that can kind of come about that, or like climate catastrophe. Definitely with mathematics too. I did a professional development and I like broke everybody into groups, and I ended up giving the Palestinian embroidery tatreez. I ended up giving the math, it just happened to be math teachers at this table where I gave it to them. And so kind of really understanding the ways that the threes one is used in math, like kind of understanding like how much to cross stitch and what designs you want to come out with that, but also how that's also an act of resistance, and how like we keep our threes. I have like the threes right up there in my office. I'm pointing up this way. In the ways that like this is resistance. And and what's also really nice is that like every village and town and city in Palestine has their own tatreez, like their own embroidered patterns. And like, if I see like a thobe or like a Palestinian dress, I can tell, oh, that's Ramallah. Oh, that's Jerusalem. Oh, that's Al Khalil. Like understanding that like even that art is also resistance. And so that can be like art, that can be math. We talked a little about science and like even thinking about climate justice with that too. So that like there's so many different avenues. And even if you are a sub, you can ask a question, and then what's going to happen? Like, you're asking a question, or you're being like, hey, have you seen this? But also if students ask, then like empowering the students to be like, well, the students ask me these questions. So like, I think thinking about it in that way. And if, you have colleagues, and I'm sure Dr. Saleh can talk more about that, but if you have, colleagues that are like, oh, thinking about the Holocaust, yes, there's the Holocaust, but what about all the different genocides before the Holocaust? And also thinking about how Israel, according to the United Nations, according to Amnesty International, according to Beit Salem, according to Human Rights Watch, all of these sources, according to the genocide scholars, they're saying that Israel's committing a genocide, and asking questions like, so what are your thoughts about that? Why do you legitimize other genocides that are part of that definition, but not this one? And being really inquisitive about that and using those sources, even though, again, Palestinians are saying that it's a genocide, we should believe them without having all these sources.
Maybe if we can close with a question about what solidarity really is, because in your piece, you are so careful to talk, you're very wide reaching, and yet you don't just gloss over anything. So it covers abolition, it covers collective care, it covers love. And one thing that I was particularly struck by was this notion that solidarity is never stagnant. It's constantly remade. I was wondering if the two of you could talk a bit more about that.
We were very intentional about not defining like, here's what's like this, like, like this is solidarity. Here's the definition, done. That it's like so much more intersectional, so much more thinking about all those different elements. And that's why we were also really intentional to say solidarities instead of solidarity, because it can be manifested in so many different ways and constant and continue to be reimagined. You know, when we were writing this, we weren't thinking like, oh, encampments. When we were writing this, we weren't thinking about maybe other forms of solidarity. But then that's why we kept it open so that these different solidarities that will happen in the future are still a part of it. And Dr. Saleh, I think, can definitely speak to more of that.
Yeah, no, I just love that you said encampments and that we weren't thinking about them. But I think for me, that was the beauty of embracing what had been used in the past, knowing your history. So when you knew that, hey, encampments had been used in student movements in the past for apartheid, against South African apartheid, against the destructive war on Vietnam. Again, so when we started to really think about what kind of tactics were used by student movements in the past, this didn't look like all that quote unquote foreign or quote unquote radical. This is a part of an established, and for civil liberties in the States, of course. So as part of established, actually, tradition of student groups taking over the space and saying, we actually demand that you divest from these things. We demand movement here. Knowing that history and knowing those solidarities, you know, across history and decades really mattered in that situation. Because if you just saw that, oh, they're taking over these radicals, Muslim sympathizers are taking over these spaces, rather than understanding that history as well.
Today's episode was produced by all of us in the Education, Genocide, Liberation class. If you like our podcast, please like us, rate us, follow us, subscribe, comment, do all of those things. You can also find us on Instagram, where Another Ed is possible. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.